One of the hardest things for an investor to master is simply knowing when to say no, especially when you've been searching for weeks, maybe even months. You finally find something that looks half decent, and suddenly all those fluttering red flags start feeling easier to ignore. You tell yourself that it might not be perfect, but it's the best deal you're going to get. And this is a trap even experienced investors can find themselves falling into. But I've seen this go badly so many times. One tiny little ignored issue turns into months of stress, extra costs, and regret. And in some cases, you end up unable to sell, remortgage, or move forward. I've reviewed hundreds of property deals, both my own and our clients, and the bad ones always have warning signs. So in this video, I'll show you 10 red flags that should make you walk away, and how to spot deals that are quietly hiding big problems. A few months ago, I sat down with a new investor who was really excited about a deal they'd just found. It was a 2-bed flat in a decent area. It had a long lease, low service charges. It was ticking all the right boxes, but something fell off. The rent they projected seemed a bit ambitious. When I asked where that figure came from, they said, "Oh, there's a flat 3 streets over asking for that." I said, "Okay, but what's it actually getting?" And they didn't have an answer. When we looked at the numbers more closely together, I noticed that there was no margin for error. There wasn't a plan for void periods or a boiler breakdown or even a slightly lower rent. The deal only worked if everything went exactly to plan, which, as you probably know, property doesn't tend to do. Here's the thing. If a deal just about stacks up on the best case scenario, it probably doesn't stack up at all. You need to be able to stress test it. Can you afford to drop the rent a little? Can you add a few weeks of vacancy? Can you throw in a couple of surprise maintenance costs without having to dip into your personal savings, take out a personal loan, or remortgage your home? Because when you're relying on perfect numbers to make something work, you may find that you're taking on more risk than you're actually comfortable with. So before you commit to anything, make sure you're using realistic rent estimates, factoring in maintenance costs. We normally say 10% for older houses and up to 5% for flats, and building in 2 to 4 weeks of voids a year. If the deal only worked when you bend the numbers, I'd argue that's a pretty big warning sign that you can't afford to ignore. Many years ago, I was close to buying a cheap ex-council flat in cash because there was a seller who needed to move fast. I was confident that it would be mortgageable in the future, but I ran it past my broker just to be on the safe side. And I'm so glad I did. Even though it was a low-rise block, a peculiarity of the layout meant that there were only 1 or 2 lenders who'd even look at it. So I pulled out of the sale because even though I could afford to buy the property without a mortgage, the last thing I needed was to have my cash tied up in a property that I might struggle to refinance or sell in the future. This is something I've seen catch people out again and again. They're in a rush or they want to beat another buyer, so they go in with cash and plan to sort out the mortgage later. But if the property has an issue, like non-standard construction, a problematic lease, or it's right next to a pub, that plan can quickly fall apart. These are fundamental issues, often with no easy fix. No refurb or clever exit strategy is going to change how a lender sees it. So if you're ever unsure, ask your broker to check whether it's actually mortgageable before you put in an offer, whether you need a loan or not. Because once your cash is stuck in a property no one else can get a mortgage on, your options can shrink really quickly. But just before we move on, if you ever find yourself second guessing the numbers on a deal, we've put together a free investor's toolkit to help. It includes the exact spreadsheets we use to run the numbers on every deal, so you can stress test it properly and see if it really stacks up. You can grab it using the link in the description. There's a house I own that should, in theory, give me an ROI of 15%. On paper, you'd think it was one of my best performers. And I'll be honest, I was drawn in by the numbers. But in reality, it's been one of the worst performing properties in my entire portfolio. There have been years when I didn't just make no profit, I lost money. I had tenants who stopped paying and refused to leave. Endless damp issues that no one could ever seem to fix properly. And a property that felt like it was falling apart faster than I could patch it back up. It wasn't even in a bad area, but it was an area in decline. Less demand, less reliable tenants, and no sign of capital growth anytime soon. This is a mistake I see a lot of investors make, especially when they're chasing yield. They find a place where the numbers look amazing and assume that the cash flow will make up for everything else. But a high return on paper doesn't mean much if the property's falling apart, you have to settle for less than ideal tenants, and it's a lottery each month as to whether the rent actually hits your bank account. So how do you avoid this? Well, before you buy, speak to local letting agents. Ask them what kind of tenants are renting in the area. Are rent arrears common? Is demand growing or falling? Sure, some agents will put a gloss on it, but if you speak to a few, you'll find one who will be honest with you. If they talk about high turnover or say it's gone a bit quiet lately, believe them, no matter how good the spreadsheet looks. Because yield alone doesn't pay the bills. You need stability, quality, and genuine signs that the area is heading in the right direction. Otherwise, as I know, that bargain can cost you far more than you expected. Every so often, I'll spot a house on Rightmove with an outdated kitchen, yellowing walls, and carpets like something out of The Shining. And the asking price will be no lower than nearby properties that are move-in ready. When the market's hot, the seller will still get their price because someone somewhere is desperate to get the deal done. I see investors overpaying for outdated properties all the time. Either they're underestimating how much the work will cost, or they're hoping to do it all themselves. If all it needs is a lick of paint or even new kitchen cabinets, that needn't be a deal breaker. But don't underestimate the cost of a refurb, because not only will lengthy renovations eat into your profits, unless you're a professional, they'll cost you your evenings and weekends too. So before you commit to anything, do a walkthrough with at least 2 contractors and get detailed written quotes. Then price in the worst case cost, not the optimistic one. If the deal doesn't work with that figure, negotiate down or walk away. Because trust me, if you spend the next 6 months fixing a property that costs exactly the same as one you could have rented out within weeks, you'll most likely be left with a bitter taste in your mouth. A lot of investors fall into the same trap with period properties. They walk into a charming Victorian terrace or a stone-built cottage and imagine tenants queuing at the door. But even the most stunning properties can be a bad investment, because when you look at the energy performance certificate, you may find that this beautiful period property is sitting at a low-grade D or E. And getting that up to a C, which could soon be the minimum standard for UK landlords, could become virtually impossible without tearing the place apart or spending tens of thousands of pounds. This is especially true for older homes that are off the gas grid or made with solid stone walls. Double glazing and a new boiler won't cut it. You're looking at internal insulation, air source heat pumps, solar panels, the kind of upgrades that sound good in theory but don't always make sense financially, especially on a small rental. The minimum allowable EPC rating is currently an E, but this could change to a C by 2028. But then again, the government's been all over the place with EPC regulation timelines, so everything's up in the air at the moment. There's talk of capping required spending around the £10,000 mark, in which case you could potentially rent out a D or E rated property as long as you reach the cap trying to improve it. But do you really want to be in that position? If you're even slightly unsure, speak to an EPC assessor before you commit. They'll usually be able to give you a rough idea of how far the property could be improved and what it would take to get there. And while the whole system might change again, the one thing that won't is this. If you buy a property you can't legally rent out in a few years' time, that's a problem, even if it has a lovely fireplace. We once spoke to an investor who thought they were picking up a dream deal. The flat was already tenanted, the rent sounded decent, and the seller assured them everything was running smoothly, only for the new investor to take over and discover that the tenants hadn't paid rent in months. And worse, the previous landlord hadn't protected their deposit properly, making it harder to evict the tenants. By the time the investor realised what they'd inherited, it was too late, and all the previous owner's mistakes had become their legal responsibility. This is something that catches a lot of people out. They assume that tenants are an automatic bonus. Who doesn't want to walk into a ready-made investment? And that can be the case. I've done it many times myself. But if the paperwork behind the tenancy isn't solid, that investment can quickly become a liability. If the previous landlord skipped a few steps, made dodgy side agreements, or failed to protect the deposit properly, you get to deal with the fallout. So before you go anywhere near exchange, ask for 3 things: a signed tenancy agreement, proof that the deposit is protected, and a clear rent payment history. If the seller can't provide this information, no deal. And yes, your solicitor should be on top of this too, but these things can slip through the cracks because tenanted properties are relatively niche, so solicitors don't deal with them every day. Every so often, you'll see someone online talking about how they bought a property with 70 years left on the lease and thought they'd found a bargain. They assumed that they'd bagged a discount and would make a quick return once they'd completed the necessary paperwork. What they didn't realise is that once a lease drops below 80 years, it becomes harder to finance, and the cost of extending that lease can skyrocket. That extra cost will, of course, eat into your profits. Now, in theory, the government's planning to make the process simpler and cheaper. There's talk of scrapping the 80-year cliff edge and standardising the process so there aren't as many nasty surprises. But progress has been slow, And until that law actually changes, the old system still applies. So unless you really know what you're doing and you factored in the lease extension cost properly, this kind of deal can turn into a headache very quickly. As a rule of thumb, you want at least 100 years on the lease. That gives you a solid 10 years before you even need to start thinking about renewal. Short leases can be an opportunity, yes, but only for investors who understand the process inside out. If that's not you, walk away. Because if lenders won't touch it and buyers aren't prepared to pay in cash, you could end up stuck with a terrible investment that doesn't just cost you money, but also keeps you up at night. At first glance, £200 a year doesn't sound like a big deal. You'll pay more for your gym membership. So when investors see a lease with that level of ground rent, they usually shrug and carry on. But there's a catch. Freeholders will often increase the ground rent over time. If you're lucky, it'll only increase in line with RPI. But if you're unlucky, you could be stuck paying ground rent that doubles every 10, 15 or 20 years. It might not seem urgent when you're buying, but try selling it in a few years when every lender has blacklisted doubling clauses and buyers are walking away the moment they see the lease. The good news is that ground rent on new leases has now been banned completely. But there are still plenty of older leases floating around with these time bombs buried deep in the small print. Your solicitor should flag this up during the process, but there have been cases where it's been missed. And in any case, it's better to spot it yourself early in the process before you waste any time or incur any costs. If you see that the ground rent doubles at set intervals, then walk. Because if you don't catch this early, you could be stuck with a property no one else wants. I know that legal documents aren't anyone's preferred bedtime reading. So if you're handed a pack full of clauses, covenants, and 50 pages of plans, I can see why you might be tempted to hand it over to your solicitor without a second thought. But putting too much distance between yourself and the legals can cause you headaches later on. Shared driveways, vague boundaries, or ancient covenants can all seem harmless until you find yourself in disputes with the neighbours, unable to extend the property, or struggling to sell. Your solicitor will give you a report on title before exchange, which is basically a summary of everything they found in the legal pack. But whatever you do, don't just ignore it or skim it. Read it from cover to cover, and if there's anything you don't understand, ask your solicitor to explain it in plain English. Some problems can be resolved with insurance, others are full-on deal breakers, and some might sound scary but aren't really an issue, which is why you need a solicitor who can explain the difference. If yours doesn't do that or seems reluctant to go into detail, keep on pushing. You're about to take legal ownership of the property. It's not the time to be polite or passive. Because once the deal exchanges, any weird clauses or unresolved issues become your problem. There's one red flag that doesn't show up on a spreadsheet or in a legal pack, but it's just as important as anything else we've talked about. It's that voice in your head saying, I'm sure it'll be fine. You've already paid for a survey. You've told a few people excitedly about the deal. And you spend hours picturing what you'll do with the place. So even though something doesn't quite sit right, you start bending the story to make it work. You tell yourself that the damp patch isn't that bad, the numbers are close enough, and you'll figure the rest out later. This is where people get caught out. Not because the deal is awful, but because they were too far in to walk away. They ignored the warning signs and now it's too late. So I'm giving you permission right now to walk away, even at the last minute or even if you've paid money that you can't get back. Because losing £500 on surveys or solicitor fees is nothing compared to losing £50,000 on a deal that drains your time, your money and your mental energy for years. If you find yourself trying to justify a deal rather than feeling genuinely sure about it, that's the number one sign you should say no. So now you know when to walk away from a deal, even if the yield looks tempting or the agent swears it's a bargain. But what if you could spot great deals before anyone else even notices them? See, there are patterns we look for, such as little details in listings, floor plans, or even postcode quirks that reveal hidden opportunities. So if you want to see exactly how we find off-market style deals on Rightmove, watch this next.